Hello and welcome to the latest Guild of One Name Studies webinar. My name is Julie Goucher and I'm going to be the host for this evening on behalf of the Guild. We've just got a few slides just to run through before I hand over to this evening's speaker. Okay, so a quick shout out for the website, and if you're a non-member, you possibly will have already found the Guild website, which is at one-name.org. And if you look on the front of the website, there is a little button that you can click to subscribe to the non-members mailing list, and that is how we manage to share information around our recordings and the presentations that we have coming up, both in terms of webinars and from our seminar team. So do sign up for that. And now just a couple of bits and pieces. So if you're looking for on the website and want to know where we are, where you would go to register, go to the events link, and then down there it says on there webinars, and there's a link there also. Once you go onto that webinars page, you'll be able to see where the back catalogue effectively of other webinars and what's coming up. So hopefully you can find your way around the screen. Please remember that I can't hear you or see you. So if you have a problem, you will need to send a question in, and I'll keep an eye on it whilst Julian is talking through this evening's presentation. Just make sure you've got your headphones connected in properly, your volume up. I know they sound really obvious, but it's amazing sometimes the obvious can be the things that we miss. This session is being recorded and it will be available for a month to the public, and then after it will become a Guild member benefit. There is a handout. If you look down on the screen, you will see, hopefully on the image, one handout is there. It says 1 of 5, so you be sure to download that. If you do forget, it will be linked to with the recording on the website. And okay, any questions? So last month I looked at the recording after the event and realized that I'd not actually got a very good image, and I meant to go back and change it to make sure that people could see there was a really good image, and probably forgot. So using my little doobry thing, magnifying thing, it's in here. It says questions, and you just plonk something in there and I'll pick it up, and they either be for the speaker at the end of the session, or if you've got a question for me that you want me to look at in between times, that's where you put the little note to me. Okay, so I'm going to hand over in just a moment to Julian Pooley from the Surrey History Centre, the book that changed my life, Discovering the Archive Behind the Gentleman's Magazine. I've heard a version of this and loved it, which is why I'm bringing it to you today. Julian is the Public Services and Engagement Manager at Surrey History Centre and an Honorary Visiting Fellow from the Centre of English Local History at the University of Leicester. He does a huge amount of writing and lecturing, and he's very active at Surrey History Centre. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand across the controls to Julian, who will deliver his presentation. So just bear with us a minute, folks, whilst Julian and I sort the magic out of getting his whiz across. And hopefully you will have got the little thing come up.
Yeah, I've just shared my screen, so hopefully everyone can see the first slide of my presentation. Is that all right?
That's fine. If anyone does want to make the slides a little bit bigger, you can do so. You see you'll see just under Julian's picture, there's a little looks like 3 or 4 little lines. Just drag on that and you can make the slide image bigger so that you're able to see it easier. I'm going to mute myself now and I'll hand over to you, Julian.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Julie. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you and your members this evening. Well, the book that changed my life is not strictly a book. It's not a printed volume, but it's a collection of small pocket engagement diaries for the years 1823 to 1834, as you can see on the screen here. It's half bound in black buckram boards with the words diary and the dates and some initials tooled on the spine in gold. I nearly missed it when I was browsing in a poorly lit corner of Keith Fawkes' Hampstead bookshop late one Friday afternoon in 1982. But holding it open near a window, I could see that the pages of each diary were full of tiny handwriting recording daily engagements, activities, and expenses throughout the year. Each diary was different. The volume opens with the Royal Engagement Pocket Atlas for 1823, illustrated with scenes from Sir Walter Scott's The Pirate, as you can see here. The title pages of other diaries are not included, but they follow a similar pattern. Printed template formats of weekly engagements, memoranda, and cash accounts, as you can see here. These showed that whoever had kept these diaries was a young lady, had pocket money to spend on gloves, sheet music, and pictures for her album, and also enjoyed visiting London attractions like Vauxhall Gardens, the Diorama, and Astley's Amphitheatre with her family. Clapham, Westminster, and Hammersmith were all mentioned, as well as Hampstead, where she was at school with the Mrs. Constable, which rang a bell with me. I was an undergraduate reading medieval history at Westfield College in preparation for my intended career in archives, but at £6, it seemed a bit pricey when there was beer and socialising to enjoy over the weekend. So I returned the tiny volume to the shelf and left the shop. But over the weekend, I discussed the volume with my friends in the Flask, the pub just across the road from the bookshop. It was clearly of local interest to Hampstead and London, but more importantly, learning to read a tiny 19th century hand would be useful for my planned career as an archivist. So I was Keith Fawkes' very first customer on Monday morning, after which the volume sat quietly on my bookshelves while I studied for my degree and postgraduate diploma. It was 4 years until I finally read and transcribed the diaries. The writer does not give her name, but there were clues. Visits to her grandfather Baker in Hampstead, gifts from her grandfather Nichols, and magic lantern shows at home by her brother John gave something to go on. But it was not until I read a short article on the Gentleman's Magazine in a journal called The Local Historian that I realised what I'd found. The article provided an account of the Nichols family, who for 3 generations between 1778 and 1856 edited and produced the Gentleman's Magazine from their printing businesses in First, Red Lion Passage in Fleet Street, and after 1819 from 25 Parliament Street in Westminster. John Nichols, his son John Bowyer Nichols, and grandson John Gough Nichols combined their printing contracts for Parliament, learned societies, and a host of private clients, with successful research interests in antiquarianism and literary biography. John Nichols had known Samuel Johnson. He was the county historian of Leicestershire and had mapped the literary lives of the long 18th century in his literary anecdotes and literary illustrations of the 18th century. Bowyer Nichols shared his father's antiquarian interests and printed most of the great county histories produced in the late Georgian period. And Gough Nichols had pioneered the study of autographs and helped to establish many of the 19th century's record publishing societies. Reference to the Dictionary of National Biography showed me that Bowyer Nichols had married Eliza, daughter of John Baker, an apothecary of Hampstead. Their 5 daughters and 3 sons matched the number of siblings mentioned by my diarist. Subsequent reference to the baptism register of St. Bride's in Fleet Street showed me that my diarist was Mary Ann Iliff Nichols, and that she was born on the 5th of April 1813, making her just 9 years old when she started keeping that diary in 1823. So my discovery became an absorbing hobby, relentlessly pursued in my spare time, identifying many of the people mentioned in the diary through the Dictionary of National Biography and the letters, articles, and obituaries in the Gentleman's Magazine. I was fascinated by how Miss Nichols's brief diary entries showed the extent of the overlap between her family's business, their research interests, and their personal lives. Mary's diary entries are generally short, but they allow us to map the networks and social world of her family and charts the development of her own interest in antiquities and autograph hunting. By 1834, the last pocket diary in this volume, she was 21 and increasingly stifled by the cramped printed template of these pocket notebooks. Her visit to Hastings later that year refers her reader to her journal, in which she would have had more freedom to describe the churches that she was visiting in the company of her father and her brother. The volume ends abruptly on the 21st of December that year, the last few pages having been lost. So I was left with a host of unanswered questions. Did she continue to keep a pocket diary? Where was her Hastings journal? And did she keep any further journals throughout her life? Did she marry? Have children? When did she die? She mentions in her diary for 1831 that Daniel Maclise had painted a family portrait of her and her siblings, and that it had been exhibited at the Royal Academy. Where was it now? I was dying to know what she looked like. And what of the provenance of the volume that I'd found in that bookshop? How did it find its way there? And crucially, were there any other Nichols business or family papers that might help my research? Well, the answer to the last of those questions was quite quickly found. At the end of the run of the Gentleman's Magazine in the British Library, I found a copy of James M. Quist's account of the family's annotated set of the magazine at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. This had been sold by Sotheby's in 1874 in their dispersal of the library of Mary's brother, John Nichols, after his death at his home, Holmwood Park, near Dorking in Surrey, the previous year. These volumes, full of annotations and inserted material which help to identify hundreds of otherwise anonymous contributors to the magazine, are accompanied by several thousand letters accumulated by Nichols as editor. The indexes at the National Register of Archives also listed other major collections of Nichols papers at the Bodleian Library, the British Library, the Beinecke Library at Yale, and the Butler Library at Columbia University in New York City. At a time before the coming of the World Wide Web, emails, and online finding aids, I wrote to each of these institutions to request copies of their catalogues so that I could build up a picture of what survived of the Nichols archive, but also to ask their curators if they knew of any further pocket diaries or journals kept by Mary Nichols. Although they were unfailingly helpful, they knew little or nothing about Miss Nichols. So, to piece together the story after the end of the diary in 1834, I turned to sources familiar to family historians. The General Register Office Index of births, marriages, and deaths showed that she died a spinster at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight in 1870. Census returns from 1841 to 1861 showed that as John Bowen Nichols's eldest and unmarried daughter, she remained with him after her mother's death in 1846. Her will, which I ordered up one lunchtime at Somerset House, was intriguing. A codicil made shortly before her death bequeathed her manuscript journals of tours to her niece, Mary Jarvis, and her collection of autograph letters, contained in 12 or more quarto cases mounted with portraits, and others in large cases mounted but without portraits, and a third series in other cases not mounted, some in drawers of an Indian cabinet and some in nests of drawers wherever they may turn up, she left to her nephew, John Bowyer Buchanan Nichols. He was just 11 at the time of his aunt's death, but she hoped that as inheritor of his grandfather's name, he would share his taste for literature. Her hopes were well founded, as he later became a poet, artist, and trustee of the Wallace Collection in London. My search for the journals took me to William Matthews's historical bibliography of British diaries written between 1442 and 1942, which was published in 1948. To my amazement, 4 volumes attributed to Miss Nichols, covering 1844 to 1866, were listed and described as journeys to various places in England and on the continent with much antiquarian detail. Matthews listed the owner as Norman Stanley Angus of Sheffield, but by 1976, when John Stuart Batts updated Matthews in his British manuscript diaries of the 19th century, their location was no longer known. So I returned to Somerset House, and I worked my way through the registers of wills in the name of Angus from 1948 to the present day. And I found that a man with the same surname of Angus had died in 1980 in Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire. Mr. Angus was described as a retired metallurgist, suggesting a link back to Sheffield and its association with the metal industry. So I wrote to the solicitors who'd overseen the will, explaining my interest and asking them if they could forward a letter on my behalf to his widow or executors. And a few days later, I was telephoned by Mrs. Angus, still living in Melton Mowbray, who treasured the 4 volumes that she and her husband had bought together in a bookshop before the war. They'd no idea who had written them, but he often read extracts from them to her, and they enjoyed looking at the architectural sketches and the early photographs of Oxford that they contained. She allowed me to borrow them, to transcribe and index them in just the same way that I'd done with the original volume of pocket diaries. And shortly before her death in 1994, Mrs. Angus presented them to me. They provide a vivid account of what Mary Nichols called her architectural pilgrimages in England and Europe. Many of these journeys were made with her father, though on a trip to Salisbury and Stonehenge in 1854, they were joined by John Britton, the architectural historian. Miss Nichols took hurried notes throughout each journey, later working them up using her father's enormous topographical library of antiquarian works, county maps, brass rubbings, and illustrations. Throughout the 1990s, as an archivist at Surrey's County Record Office, I was deeply involved in rescuing the records of Surrey's former psychiatric and learning disability hospitals that were closing down then as part of the government's drive to end long-term institutional care and encourage more care in the community. One of my survey visits took me to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Red Hill, a huge institution established in the 1850s to care for people deemed, in the terminology of the day, to be idiots or imbeciles. I arrived rather early, and a member of staff who offered me a coffee asked me how she might begin to research the history of her house, Holmwood Park, near Dorking. Our mutual astonishment can only be imagined. She'd found somebody who knew more than she ever dreamed possible about the Nichols family who'd lived in her house from the 1860s until the mid-20th century. And I was now given the opportunity to visit the very house from which a significant part of this once vast library and literary collections accumulated by the Nicholses had been dispersed by Sotheby's sales. Though damaged when used to billet Canadian soldiers during the war, and now divided into apartments, much of the original fabric, including, and you can just see it down here, if you can see my cursor on the screen, the stained glass that John Nichols had put into the hallway down here, was still remained. Not long after my visit, Jill phoned me with further exciting news. She'd recently been to a party, and she'd met an elderly gentleman there who said he was a descendant of Emma Nichols, one of Mary's sisters. And crucially, from my point of view, he was still in touch with the Nichols family. This was the break that I'd been looking for. This gentleman was able to put me in touch with families who were descended in various ways from the Nicholses. Throughout 1996, I was invited to lunch by each of these families at their homes across England. One branch owned a copy of Daniel Maclise's portrait of the family of John Bowyer Nichols, and so, after 15 years, I was finally able to come face to face with my diarist, depicted holding a book with her brother, John Nichols. When I visited an elderly lady whose mother had been a Nichols and had grown up in Holmwood Park, she was sorry that she had nothing much to show me, but wondered if I might be interested in a few letters. We were having coffee in her sitting room, and she reached over to a large wicker hamper next to a wood-burning stove. I'd assumed it contained logs, but she lifted out 6 large folio albums and a quarto volume, each containing hundreds of letters. She explained that they'd come via her mother from Holmwood Park. The quarto volume contained 445 letters to John Nichols from Joseph Craddock of Gumley in Leicestershire, a writer, traveller and landscape gardener to whom Nichols was distantly related. These letters span the period 1791 to 1826, and as well as charting Nichols's printing of Craddock's literary works, they are full of anecdotes about Samuel Johnson, Oliver Goldsmith, and details of Nichols's visits to Gumley when researching his county history of Leicestershire. The 6 folio albums were tooled with the words "Family Records" on the spine, and they spanned the dates 1800 to 1823, being volumes 6 to 13 of what I recognised to be part of a series of albums that were created by John Bowyer Nichols to preserve a chronological account of his family's life and friendships from the 1760s through to the mid-1850s. These albums are full of letters, drawings, and printed ephemera, but scholars have generally overlooked them because they appear to relate more to the Nichols family than to its business. But I think that this is their greatest strength, because through this domestic detail, they throw light on the way the family printing firm was run and allow us to study the minutiae of its day-to-day business. I had consulted the earlier part of this series, held by the Butler Library of Columbia University in New York, on microfilm. Only months before, in December 1995, 7 later volumes in this series, numbers 14 to 20, covering 1824 to 1854, had appeared at Bonham's and were subsequently acquired by the Bodleian Library in Oxford. These volumes in that wicker hamper filled the gaps. Those at Columbia and the Bodleian had originally been sold by Sotheby's in their 1929 sale of the remaining portion of the Library of John Nichols at Holmwood Park. So the emergence of these new volumes from the wicker hamper suggested that the family had retained some as heirlooms. The owner explained that as she was about to sell her house and move into a flat, the volumes would pass to her daughters, but she kindly gave me their contact details for future reference. The scale of what remained in private hands became clear on my visit to another branch of the family in February 1996. It was a bitterly cold day, with flurries of snow on an easterly wind, and the large country house that I was visiting had scant heating beyond the Aga in the kitchen. The owner showed me through to the icy hall to the library, shelved floor to ceiling, as you can see here, on 2 sides, with Gianelli's bust of John Nichols on a plinth in one corner, and a good pile of logs next to the stove. He suggested that I keep an eye on the stove, because if he went out, the room would become very cold very quickly. Lunch would be at 1, he said, and as he had some business to attend to, he hoped he wouldn't mind if he left me to explore the library. He pointed to a small white plastic suitcase on the floor, which he'd found in the attic that morning and he thought might be of interest. It was crammed with letters. The first was from Humphrey Repton, the landscape gardener, to Josiah Boydell, painter and engraver, concerning one of Repton's famous red books. It was accompanied by 3 drawings by Repton and one of his engraved business cards. Beneath that was this letter written by Captain James Cook, the circumnavigator, dated Resolution, Table Bay, Cape of Good Hope, 19th of November, 1776. And then underneath that, there were letters of admirals, politicians, writers, artists, and antiquaries dating from the mid-17th century right through to the mid-19th century. Many of them were annotated in the top left corner to identify the sender, and I immediately recognized the hand of my diarist, Mary Nichols. This was clearly part of her once large collection of autographs described so tantalizingly in that codicil to her will. So was there any more? Well, it was far too cold to venture into the attic on that first visit, but on my return in spring, the owner showed me through a small door leading from an upstairs corridor into the capacious timber-framed roof space. A bookcase just inside was full of 19th century box files. 10 of them, as you can see here on the lower shelf, were emerald green and tooled autographs on spine. Others, as you can see, were of different sizes, but all of them were tightly filled with more autograph letters, just as Mary had described them in her will. Those in the green boxes were mounted with portraits. They were in good alphabetical order, and the red crayon marking many of them up for printing, along with annotations by John Nichols as well as Mary's father and brother, showed that a significant number had been used in the Gentleman's Magazine, the Literary Anecdotes, the Literary Illustrations, and other works that had passed through the Nichols press. Other letters, many of them from European royalty, popes, cardinals, composers, scientists, politicians, artists, and writers, were in wrappers and priced, suggesting that though Miss Nichols based her autograph collection on her family's business and personal archive, she'd actually bought heavily in the London sale rooms and in the Paris sale rooms and Marseille, and exchanged duplicates with fellow autograph hunters. Turning round from looking at that bookcase, the rest of the attic was piled high with trunks and tin chests containing further papers, as well as portfolios and framed portraits. And the portraits you can see on the floor here are of Mary's father, John Nichols, and her mother, Eliza. More of Miss Nichols's autograph collection emerged on my subsequent visits to the house. Several hundred letters had been hidden in the back of a large chest of drawers and were discovered on a wet afternoon when the owner decided to sort out his socks. And a tea chest in another part of the attic, covered in dust and bat droppings, proved to contain hundreds more, including letters addressed to David Garrick, the actor, and Humphrey Wanley, the antiquary. Many of these letters are known to scholars because they had been printed in the Literary Anecdotes and Illustrations. But annotation and deletions by John Nichols show that he did not always print them in their entirety. There are also many letters in this collection that are of interest to scholars because they've lain unseen for well over a century, and they fill gaps in the surviving correspondence of several important literary figures. This letter of John Cleland, the author of Fanny Hill, was written to Edward Dickinson, lawyer to Cleland's mother, in November 1758, and will feature shortly in an edition of Cleland's correspondence currently being prepared for Cambridge University Press by Peter Sabor and Helen Williams. And this letter, written by Sarah Fielding, the sister of Henry Fielding, to Samuel Richardson, the printer and author, in April 1758, relates to Sarah's novel, The Lives of Cleopatra and Octavia, and was included by Tom Keemer in his Cambridge edition of the works and correspondence of Samuel Richardson. This letter from Jane Porter, a novelist once as famous as Sir Walter Scott, who lived for several years in Thames Ditton here in Surrey, relates to the obituary of Percival Stockdale, the poet and anti-slavery campaigner, that she wrote for the Gentleman's Magazine in 1811. It's accompanied by this charming portrait of Miss Porter that has been included in Devaney Lucer's biography of Porter, published last October. And here we see a letter written by Mary Shelley to Thomas Crofton Croker, an antiquary who lived in Hammersmith and was a friend of the Nichols family. It dates from 1829 and probably relates to Shelley's book The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck, which she published the following year. The international scope of the collection is shown by this slide, showing a letter from Bernard de Montfaucon, pioneer of paleography, alongside a musical score by Henri Marschner, a German composer, for verses by Louise Brachmann, one of 18 German manuscripts in this collection. And this letter from Jacques-Joseph Champollion-Figeac, archaeologist, would be of interest to Egyptologists for its analysis and discussion of hieroglyphs. So I'd been looking for further diaries, journals and artworks of Mary Nichols, but had found previously unexplored parts of her family's archive instead, clearly of significance for scholars interested in the history of the book trade, antiquarianism, collecting and European cultural life throughout the long 18th century. These discoveries inspired me to design a database which would enable me to manage detailed calendars of every letter that I found in these private collections, so that scholars working on the wider Nichols archive could see these letters in context with this privately owned material. So, as an example, here we see a letter written by Thomas Faulkner, historian of Kensington and Chelsea, to John Bow Nichols in 1822. You can see from the annotation in pencil at the top that it was submitted to Nichols for the Gentleman's Magazine, and it relates to the planned demolition of Winchester House in Chelsea, home of the Bishops of Winchester. Faulkner hopes that publicity in the magazine will raise public awareness of this 17th century building and encourage people to visit it before it's too late. In this slide, you can see my calendar of this letter on the database. I can then index these letters in limitless ways while still retaining the original structure of the archive as it was left by its creators. And here we see a screenshot showing 4 of the 6 letters I found between Thomas Faulkner and the Nichols family. They cover the period 1813 to 1830 and are now divided between the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the National Portrait Gallery Library in London, and 2 private collections, but they can be reassembled on the database. Each of the major private collections has now been calendared, totaling some 7,000 letters. And as I'm now adding details of Nichols letters that are held in over 100 libraries and archives across the world, the database currently contains over 20,000 letters, allowing the epistolary conversations of 3 generations of the Nichols family with the clients of their printing house, fellow members of the book trade, antiquaries, artists, engravers, as well as family and friends, to be reconstructed, even though the originals are dispersed or in private hands. Well, so much for the discovery of the archive. In the second part of this paper, I'd like to look more closely at John Nichols and see what the archive can tell us about his achievements as an early genealogist and local historian. Few people in the long 18th century were more immersed in genealogical research than John Nichols. As printer and editor of the Gentleman's Magazine, county historian of Leicestershire, and printer of most of the great Georgian county histories, some connection can be found between Nichols and almost every significant antiquarian or biographical activity of his day. The Nichols Archive provides important evidence for the culture of genealogical research in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and it's a major tool for mapping social networks of correspondence in an age when the research, visualization and circulation of genealogies were the foundation of a wider genealogical culture. So I'd like to discuss the role of the Gentleman's Magazine in recording the lineage and status of families and explore the ways in which Nichols developed this role after becoming editor and printer of the magazine in 1778. I'll assess the importance that Nichols himself placed upon kinship, explore his relationship with the wider antiquarian community, and show how his engaging enthusiasm and genial personality enabled him, a London printer, to break through social barriers and gain access to the personal archives of noble families and landed gentry across the country. I'll also show how he skillfully used networks of local experts to research, record, and verify the pedigrees of families across all levels of society, both for his own research and that of the antiquaries who commissioned his press to print the results of their own genealogical labours. John Nichols will be familiar to anyone interested in the literary culture of the long 18th century. His literary anecdotes of the 18th century and its continuation, the literary illustrations, are fundamental for the study of the Georgian book trade and its customers. But he did a lot more besides this. Renaissance scholars are indebted to his progresses of Queen Elizabeth for preserving in print an extraordinary range of resources for the life and culture of the Elizabethan court. He's equally familiar to local historians for his encyclopedic county history of Leicestershire, produced in 8 folio volumes between 1795 and 1815. He was also an early biographer of Hogarth, an editor of the works of Swift, friend and research assistant to Samuel Johnson, and a skilled printer who designed the typeface for the very first printed facsimile of Domesday Book. And amidst all of these interests, he was also, of course, Sylvanus Urban, the pseudonymous editor and printer of the Gentleman's Magazine, as you can see at the bottom of this slide here. He owed these wide interests to his apprenticeship and partnership with the printer William Bowyer the Younger, where he was introduced to Bowyer's many clients from worlds of letters, scientific discovery, and antiquarian research. Bowyer was the ideal master for young Nichols. He'd had a Cambridge education and he saw printing itself as a form of historical scholarship. He was closely involved in editing and correcting the learned works that passed through his press, and in engaging young Nichols to assist him, he inspired his apprentice with a love of editing and research that would shape his future interests and career. So when Nichols succeeded to Bowyer's business on Bowyer's death in 1777, he paid tribute to him with a memorial pamphlet, anecdotes, biographical and literary, of the late Mr. William Bowyer, printer, compiled, as you can see, for private use. This little thing was only 52 pages long and only 12 copies were printed. But in sending them to Bowyer's closest friends, he found that corrections and new material flooded in. By 1782, he had enough new material to print a revised edition of some 700 pages called the Biographical and Literary Anecdotes of William Bowyer. And this grew in, as you can see on the screen here, this grew into the Literary Anecdotes of the 18th Century, which ran to 9 volumes by 1815, and then was continued by a further 8 volumes of the literary illustrations that were completed by his son in 1858. By which time the pages had increased from 52 to nearly 14,000. This is a basic source for 18th century lives and letters, and for the lineage of its subjects, many of whom had been leading figures in the fields of genealogy and heraldry. Nichols's plan to write a memoir of William Bowyer had developed into a biography of the press and its customers, but such prodigious growth had not simply come from the handful of Bowyer's friends who'd seen the original pamphlet. In 1778, Nichols had acquired a significant share in the Gentleman's Magazine. This was a hugely popular monthly periodical established by Edward Cave in 1731. In 1782, he became both its printer and its editor and steered it on a course that appealed to its large international readership and proved successful for his business and his own research. By publishing his memoir of Bowyer serially in the magazine, he took it in a new direction, placing it at the heart of contemporary anecdotal and biographical culture. This was very new, and it coincided with the growing interest in lives and letters sparked by Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Andrew Kippis's Biographica Britannia, in both of which Nichols was involved as a contributor, printer, and bookseller. Readers responded by submitting anecdotes of their own and manuscripts that Nichols then printed in the magazine and absorbed within his own works. He developed the role of the magazine's editor, traditionally called Sylvanus Urban, to a far greater extent than any of his predecessors, encouraging his readers to contribute articles, notes, and queries to the magazine. But Nichols was not just the editor of the magazine. He was also one of its most prolific and ingenious of contributors, planting letters in each monthly issue, seeking information and encouraging debate. He used so many pseudonyms for this that very few of his readers were aware of the extent of his contributions and were only now beginning to disentangle the complex relationship between his magazine and the printed text of other works. All of the names on this page are John Nichols, but very few people would have known that. I mean, obviously, Antiquarius, I suppose, is obvious, Biographicus. Caradoc, heaven knows where that came from, or Eugenio. But Hinckleyensis is a clue. He married 2 women from Hinckley in Leicestershire, as we shall see. He was born in Islington, hence the Islingtoniensis. Some of these he wrote when he was in his 80s, so he called himself octogenarius. M. Green he used a lot. That was probably his most popular pseudonym. M. Green was Martha Green, the name of his second wife. An old liveryman, well, he would be because he was master of the stationers' company in 1804. And viator, well, that means traveller, and he did travel a lot. So there are clues in all of these names that he used. Since its inception, the Gentleman's Magazine had provided a monthly snapshot of the state of the country's elite families. Every issue contained announcements of births, marriages, and deaths, as well as promotions of civil, military, and ecclesiastical offices. Though aimed at those who aspired to gentlemanly status, it was nevertheless a showcase for the nation's hierarchy. The lists of births were dominated by the announcement of sons to the nobility, the gentry, members of parliament, and bishops. Marriage announcements resonated with the importance of lineage, rarely given the bride's Christian name, but usually listing her dowry and the promise of future payments on the birth of each child. The same can be seen in the list of deaths, where longer entries for the nobility celebrated their good breeding and inheritance. Gillian Williamson has explored this in detail in her study of British masculinity in the Gentleman's Magazine, showing how these elite concerns were modified during the course of the 18th century as the broadening of the magazine's readership reflected changes in society. Though births were still stubbornly elite by the time that Nichols became editor in 1782, marriage listings were being invaded by tradesmen who had celebrated their commercial success in the magazine, and the announcements of deaths now paid more attention to occupations and celebrated the independent success of self-made men. So Nichols built on these changes, doubling the length of the magazine in 1783 to allow more space for detailed obituaries, reworked from notices in provincial newspapers and enhanced by letters and memoirs supplied by families and friends of the deceased. In doing so, Nichols was creating a body of biography which forged a relationship between genealogy and the expanding biographical culture of the late 18th century. The basic recitals of names in the lists of deaths in the magazine's earliest issues were now being replaced by engaging anecdotes, lively memoirs, and poignant sketches of lives lived by a very broad range of people. Status gave way to personality and achievement. Nichols was careful to be accurate, and an obituary one month would often be followed in the following issue by additions and corrections from readers. This crowdsourcing refinement proved crucial to the success of both the magazine and Nichols's own research projects, especially his county history of Leicestershire. Nichols did not set out to be a county historian. He was a printer whose experience of editorial scholarship with Bowyer and contribution to Johnson's Lives of the Poets pointed perhaps more towards literary rather than antiquarian interests. But this changed in the early 1780s through his friendship with the antiquary Richard Gough and his involvement in a legal case to settle a disputed inheritance. Richard Gough was director of the Society of Antiquaries, and Nichols worked closely with him as printer of the Society's transactions and also in completing John Hutchins's History and Antiquities of Dorset, which was just one of several county histories produced by the Bowyer Press. Nichols also worked closely with Gough in a pioneering work on royal and noble wills, which builds on previous studies of the peerage by Sandford and Dugdale. Rosemary Sweet has described Gough as having an unrivaled network of correspondence which enabled him to act as broker and communicator of antiquarian knowledge for the country at large. And by working so closely with him, Nichols fell into what he quite fondly called the dry, thorny and barbarous paths of national and local antiquities. For Gough, genealogy and local history were civilized accomplishments demanded by an enlightened society. The writing of local history in the 18th century was rooted in the growth of the county as an administrative unit, the rise of the landed classes, and the pride that people felt in their local area. And yet, by 1768, when Gough published his Anecdotes of British Topography, antiquarian research was rather losing its way, and he lamented how incorrect pedigrees, futile etymologies, verbose disquisitions, crowds of epitaphs, lists of landholders, and such farrago thrown together without method, unanimated by reflections, and delivered in the most uncouth and horrid style, make the bulk of our county histories. Such works bring the study of antiquities into disgrace with the generality and disgust the most candid curiosity. Whoever sits down to compile a history and antiquities of a county or a town should confirm the evidence he collects from books and from manuscripts by inspection of the places described. So Gough showed Nichols that genealogy needed to be set in topographical context, founded on thorough research and presented clearly on the printed page. But why did Nichols, a London printer with no direct family links to the county, become the county historian of Leicestershire? Well, the short answer to that is women. Nichols married twice, and both of these ladies came from Hinckley. His first wife was Anne Craddock, daughter of a London tailor whose family came from Hinckley. Nichols met her while he was still apprenticed to Bowyer, and he married her in 1766, but she died in childbirth 10 years later. In 1777, he met another Hinckley girl, Martha Green. He married her in 1778, but she also died 10 years later, again from complications associated with pregnancy. 20 years of married life to these women, with regular visits to the area, established ties of kinship with Hinckley and the rest of the county that awakened Nichols's interest in Leicestershire. These ties were significant. Martha Green's ancestors included John Cleveland. Here we are. Where is he? There he is. John Cleveland, a 17th century English poet who was the son of Thomas Cleveland, an early vicar of Hinckley. One of the poet's brothers was an ancestor of Bishop Thomas Percy, who Nichols knew because Bowyer had printed his Relics of Ancient Poetry in 1765. And as if that was not enough, by his first marriage to Anne Craddock, who was descended from John One-by of Hinckley, Nichols was connected with the antiquary Thomas Staveley, grandfather of the poet Leonard Wellsted. So, by marriage to Anne Craddock, Nichols was able to claim kinship with both an antiquary and two poets associated with Leicestershire. But beyond all of these connections, it was a legal wrangle over the One-by inheritance that did more than anything to encourage Nichols to study the county's history. Very briefly, Anne Craddock's father, William, was one of the heirs to the considerable estates of Robert One-by. Under Robert's will of 1743, all of this property had passed to a maternal cousin, with reversion to Robert's heirs. But as Robert had no heirs or descendants, his heirs had to be found among the descendants of his ancestors. And this was when Nichols, the son-in-law from London, skilled in textual analysis, came into his own. He used the Hinckley parish registers, the epitaph on John One-by's monument of 1622 in Hinckley Church, and records at the College of Arms to show that the heirs of Robert One-by were the descendants of the of the 4 daughters of John won by, and one of these, Emmet, was an ancestor of Nichols's first wife, Anne, and the children that Nichols had had with her were therefore in line for a share of the £2,300 of the estate. So the case was crucial, both in providing financial security to Nichols's daughters and in igniting his interest in local history and realization of the practical value of family history. Parish registers were not quite so dry and barbarous as he might once have thought. Nichols's county history of Leicestershire grew out of the fulfilment of a duty to his first wife and became a monument to the memory of the second. Kinship was important to Nichols. In 1780, he dedicated his select collection of poems, a miscellany of fugitive pieces unearthed in the course of helping Johnson with his Lives of the Poets, to Bishop Thomas Percy, not just because his relics of ancient poetry had transformed the study of English literature, but because their shared lineage through the poet Thomas Cleveland. Close reading of the pedigrees printed by Nichols in his County History of Leicestershire shows his debt to Gough in clearly presenting complicated information on the printed page, and his own fascination with the biographical stories behind the countless names hanging from these printed family trees. Pride of place, for example, is given to elite pedigrees, such as this one of the Greys, the Earls of Stamford and Warrington, printed over 2 facing pages and displaying the rich history and checkered fortunes of this family from the Norman Conquest at the very top left to the late 18th century at the bottom right, including, as you can see here, Jane, daughter of Henry Grey, wife of Guildford Dudley, who was proclaimed Queen of England in 1553 and executed the following year. This pedigree even continues over the page, taking the family down to 1801, before continuing with another branch of the Greys of Staffordshire. Other trees are more modest, covering just the 18th century and printed at the end of the parish's history, like this one of the Smith family of Gadsby. But even here, we can see that Nichols has based it on a pedigree entered at the College of Arms in 1718. You can just see it up here. And included a cross-reference to a plate where the reader will find the family's arms engraved. Here we see a very nice example of the care that Nichols took in supplementing these printed pedigrees with a virtual museum of their family's seals and devices. Some trees were printed within the body of Nichols's text, like this one, the G family of Rothley, again with the description of their arms and a cross-reference to a plate, while others are printed landscape and cascade over a number of pages, like this one of the Babington family, also of Rothley, which traces their lineage from the 12th to the 16th century on this page, and then continues all the way down to 1812, the date of publication, on the second. This detail shows just how much work Nichols is putting into this genealogy. The structure itself is based on heraldic visitations at the British Museum and the College of Arms, but it's been supplemented by biographical details from parish registers and family papers, recording places of birth, education, career, parish of marriage, cause of death, and place of burial. These are the county families of Leicestershire: farmers, clergy, doctors, university academics, sheriffs and merchants, people who Nichols had come to know on his regular visits to the county, staying with his kinsfolk, visiting churches, and transcribing epitaphs. His county history is not a pageant of the elite. Gentry and nobility are now part of the wider community of county families, whose engagement with Nichols in this enormous undertaking and pride in his work is witnessed by their willingness to increase their subscriptions to the work when so much of it was lost in his printing house fire of 1808. Indeed, the campaign to support him after this tragedy was not launched by the gentry at their quarter sessions, but announced at Leicester horse races and promoted by the local newspaper. There are nearly 700 pedigrees in Nichols's Leicestershire, and even though the work took 25 years to complete, there is no way that he could have achieved this on his own. Most county historians did try it on their own, and the majority of them either went mad or ended up in debtors' prisons. But Nichols was very different. As editor of the Gentleman's Magazine, he could draw on a host of interested readers willing to assist by visiting churches, transcribing monuments, finding manuscripts and rare books, and crucially checking proof sheets of each page as it passed through the press. My work on the Nichols papers has identified nearly 300 of these helpers. His correspondence with them and the annotation in the books that he owned shows how he did it. Primarily, there were the leading county families. John Herrick of Bow Manor first wrote to Nichols in 1791 when he told him that his family had lived in Leicestershire for centuries and his family papers were at his service. Over the next decade, he provided crucial help, giving Nichols free access to his records, allowing him to make Bow Manor his headquarters, and even checking epitaphs and registers in neighbouring parishes. All of this is chronicled in their correspondence, extending to nearly 100 letters, now split between the Bodleian Library, Yale University, and several private collections. Rebuilding the original Order on My database allows us to listen into their conversations, follow their research, and watch a friendship develop and grow between the two families that would last for nearly a century. They gradually constructed the Herrick pedigree from family papers and epitaphs, and then by endlessly correcting proof sheets which travelled daily between London and Leicestershire. The lengths that they both went to ensure the work was correct can be glimpsed in this postscript to a letter of 1797, in which Nichols seeks clarification on deaths and marriages in the Keck family. Most of Leicestershire's elite families were keen to help. Robert Shirley of Staunton Harold's 7th Earl of Ferrers welcomed Nichols to his home, joined him on topographical field trips, and lent him the local parish registers, enjoying his conversation at dinner for the evening. But this son of an Islington baker, a London printer, could be on such comfortable terms with nobility and gentry testifies to the ways in which genealogical and antiquarian interests could break through normal social barriers. Nichols's enthusiasm, energy, and genial personality afforded him considerable social mobility. Nichols rarely supplied his compositors or assistants with pages of copy that he'd written himself. Instead, the transcripts, corrected proof sheets, and other scraps that he'd collected were numbered in order and annotated by him, leaving the pressman to compose them and his correspondents to correct them. This page, bound into Nichols's own copy of the county history, shows the typical early stages of a Leicestershire pedigree. Deletions, additions, and paste downs all testify to the creative and the corrective process. But this was just the start. Once this was set in type, the fluidity of these draft pedigrees gradually coalesced into final form. Teams of local people shared the burden of this research. At Hinckley, John Ward subcontracted the task of checking Nichols's proof sheets to local experts, local landowners, surgeons, and the owner of a private museum. At Claybrook, the Reverend Orley Macaulay and his neighbours joined together as a sort of advisory committee, exchanging and discussing Nichols's proof sheets among themselves and sending him the results. While one of them would visit local churches to transcribe the monumental inscriptions, another would check the work, while somebody else in the group checked the pedigrees of local families against family papers or family tombs. Macaulay then gathered the corrected materials together and returned them to Nichols. So Nichols's county history was rooted in the sociability of amateur networks of research and friendship. Nichols supplemented his work with his assistants with the research at the College of Arms and the British Museum, and his use of the topographical and genealogical works in his own library. There's no time to explore this in detail today, but study of successive sale catalogues of 3 generations of the Nichols family shows that they were all key collectors of heraldic and genealogical books, many of which were annotated and extra illustrated. Just one example. This copy of William Burton's earlier History of Leicestershire is a case in point. It had previously been owned by Michael Burton and William Cole, and his pages are full of their corrections and additions to pedigrees. As a county historian who was his own printer, Nichols was able to disentangle this information, consult the families, and then present the final results clearly on the printed page. Nichols's interests in biography, antiquarianism, and genealogy were his personal contribution to the Age of Enlightenment. His History of Leicestershire struck a new balance between genealogy and topography that greatly influenced subsequent county historians. His work was continued by his son, John Bayer Nichols, who at the same time as helping his father with Leicestershire, superintended the publication of Owen Manning and William Bray's History and Antiquities of Surrey, published in 3 volumes between 1804 and 1814. He went on to serve as midwife to most of the other large Georgian county histories, notably George Lipscomb's Buckinghamshire, George Baker's Northamptonshire, Robert Surtees's Durham, and Sir Richard Colt Hoare's History of Wiltshire, all of which include family histories and genealogies that are still used by family historians today. Though John Gough Nichols inherited his family's antiquarian interest, the world of topographical printing was changing by the time that he joined the firm in 1826. As well as editing the Gentleman's Magazine, he produced specialist publications like the Collectanea Topographica et Genealogica, the Topographer and Genealogist, and the Herald and Genealogist, for genealogical articles that were being increasingly squeezed out of the Gentleman's Magazine as it sought to embrace a larger circle of literature. By now, the publication of lavish county histories was giving way to smaller, specialised works produced by printing societies, whose members would receive academic editions of historic documents in return for their annual subscriptions. The first of these was the Surtees Society, of which Gough Nichols was a founder member in 1834. Encouraged by its success, in 1838, Gough Nichols helped to establish the Camden Society to publish manuscripts and new editions of rare printed books. He was also a founder member of the Royal Archaeological Institute in 1844, the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society in 1855, and he contributed to the work of Surrey Archaeological Society. He became convinced that a national topographical society with county branches would be the best means of promoting local historical research. Though he did not live to see the establishment of the Victoria County History in 1889, Gough Nichols' devotion to rigorous scholarly editing and the assistance that he gave to the formation of county societies where local people could meet, share research, and organise field trips ensured that the topographical and genealogical achievements of his family and their press were embedded in the increasing professionalisation of historical research in Victorian Britain, laying the foundations for the work of county and national family history societies today. Well, we've come a long way from my discovery of the pocket diaries of Mary Nichols in that Hampstead bookshop in 1982, but I hope that the story of how that tiny volume led me to uncover tens of thousands of letters and papers that highlight the importance of this family of printers and antiquaries will serve as an example of how researching a single document can uncover an extraordinary story, which in my case certainly did change my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. That was excellent presentation. I loved it the first time I kind of heard it. It was good to get a really good spin on the book, and I was kind of thinking, and how long is it going to be until not just the database is ready? Because I understand it's a huge undertaking. I can see a book in this. Sorry, but but I can see a book in this. I think this is a really great topic, but it's a kind of an indication of all the rabbit holes that we can go down as we find something, whatever the something is, and then in our sort of on our journey to understand the thing, how it becomes so much more than just that one thing. Anyone who's doing a one name study will understand that, because you're gathering data and you're collecting it up and you're displaying it in a way into, say, a database of some kind, as opposed to an Excel spreadsheet. But it's so much more because you're building the context to it, and that's what you've done with this. And this is something why I'm so fascinated with it. So do you see a book in this at the end?
I certainly see something in it. I mean, I publish a lot of articles as I go on particular themes, but there's certainly potential for a book. I would love to write a biography of John Nichols. It is crying out to be done. He's the only member of Johnson's circle of friends that has not been covered by his own biography. I think that is because he's so broad in his interests, it's very hard to get a handle on him. But there's certainly a story to be told, and I think the story needs to be told in, as you say, the background to the discovery of the diary, and the sources that I've used and how the archive can bring it all to light.
Have you had to buy much? I mean, okay, you found things with various people and organisations, but have you actually purchased anything? Have you got an eBay search, for example?
I don't collect Nichols documents as such, but I do obviously I purchase copies of Nichols letters from the repositories that own them so that I can calendar them.
Yeah.
I've been very fortunate in that the key sources have been gifted to me by people who share my interest.
Okay.
So I have my own set of the literary anecdotes and the literary illustrations, because a fellow book collecting friend of mine managed to acquire them and years ago, and he decided when he heard about my research that they would be better on my shelves, and indeed I use them every single day. And I'm also very fortunate to have a copy of Nichols's Leicestershire, which is a very rare book now. But again, someone that I helped with his family history research. He is the descendant of the Bazire family of engravers, and he wrote a book on them a few years ago, and I helped him enormously with that book. He then said, well, I've got a book that you might be interested in. Would you like it as a gift in recognition of your help? And sure enough, these 8 volumes arrived here on a pallet a couple of days later. I can't tell you the look on my wife's face when I took them home, because they take up most of the house. So yeah, I've been very fortunate, but I do buy copies of documents where I can.
Yeah, that's I can envisage the look on your wife's face, because I see that look on my husband's face as I go to an archive or I go to a bookshop or anything like that. It's like, why couldn't you just do knitting like most normal people, as opposed to having to research people that are dead? We've got a question from a member, Marion, in fact, and she says, you mentioned that John Bowen Nichols lived in Hill House in Clapham. Do you happen to know in which road that property was located, please?
It was in Matrimony Place. I don't quite know where that was, but I think it was on the Battersea end of Clapham, because Mary says in her diary that she would walk through the cornfields underneath the house nearly to Battersea. And I've used the land tax records that we have here at Surrey History Centre in the quarter sessions to have a look at Matrimony Place. And most of the people who were living there at the time when Mary and her family lived there and are mentioned in her diary. So I know I've pinned it down, and I've also found a lovely watercolour of the house by a topographical artist called Robert Schnebley, who also taught the Nichols children to draw. That's in private hands. So yes, I roughly know where it was, but I'd be hard pressed to find it now because I think Clapham's changed rather a lot.
So I guess the maps, there must be the map collection that they've got at the National Archives or
Yeah, you
NACLB
could do it from
in
that. Yeah,
Scotland.
you could work it out from that. Yeah, because you could also work it out from the route taken by the land tax assessor.
Yeah, so that would work.
Yeah.
Hopefully, Marion, that answers your question. So she says, okay, off Wandsworth Road over the north side of the common.
Yeah, that sounds about right, actually. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Els has asked a question. So this is Els Chudgy from the SOG. Which of the John Nichols was known as the Death Hunter? Was it the first? Great talk, and of course, so many of those work at the SOG library. Yes, there
Yeah, it
is.
was John Nichols who was the Death Hunter. He was lampooned by a satirical writer called, well, his pen name was Peter Pindar, but his name was John Walcott. And he wrote some execrable poetry, and he took the P out of a lot of people contemporary. And Nichols slated one of his books in the Gentleman's Magazine. And so in return, Walcott wrote a benevolent epistle to Sylvanus Urban Gent, which really took the, well, basically satirized him as a printer and a death hunter, and preserving in the pages of the magazine the ghosts of people who were fixed forever in its grim pages. It's a tremendous piece of work. And Thomas Rowlandson, the architect, the caricaturist and cartoonist, he accompanied that poem with a wonderful view of Nichols fulminating against it. It's tremendous, and I cover that in another talk.
Okay, I may email you then. I'm sure we have people that they sort of, some people are just really interesting and you listen to them and you just think, my God, I just wish I could have them on kind of a speed dial. So a badge of honor as far as I'm concerned. Elle says, yeah, I think that's I think this has been a great talk, and thank you so much for indulging me and coming to give it to the guild. We're going to wrap up in just a moment, so I'm just waiting to see if there's any other questions. I think I've been a journal keeper since I was in senior school. I'm a Surrey girl, and my senior school, we were presented with this small little book. I don't know, probably about a third of an A5 page, something like that. And this was meant to be a homework book. But it became real quickly that it just expanded itself as I found I had to stick bits in with sellotape and paper clips and that kind of thing. And I've always kept a journal. So for me, the title was the book that changed my life. It's like, I've got to read this, I've got to hear this talk, and can I see it? And then the images as it opens up and you can see the small constraints of pages, and you know that the girl is doomed because it just isn't going to be big enough. It's going to expand into something. What happened beyond it? She obviously continued writing? Do we
Well,
know
yeah,
what happened?
I don't know whether she kept any more pocket diaries because I haven't yet found any more. My goodness, I've looked.
Mhm.
I managed to trace those 4 volumes of her travel diaries to Mrs. Angus's collection. And it's clear from the numbering on the spine that she kept a lot of them. I've only got 4. I think she must have kept, 20 or 30 of these volumes of her travels around the country. So she was a very prolific writer of her travels. Whether or not she kept a personal diary in the same way, I don't know. But she certainly recorded her movements both in England and on the continent throughout her life, and continually embellished them, like you did, with press cuttings of events that she'd attended and reviews of books that she'd read and accounts of the churches that she visited. And what makes them so interesting to me is that she's visiting many English parish churches in the mid-19th century, just when the Victorians were ripping them apart, tearing out those Georgian box pews, triple-decker pulpits and whatever, and the medieval tiles. and putting in raised altars and a very formalized view of what they thought a medieval church should look like. So she's walking in through the scaffolding and stepping over the rubble with antiquaries to explore them at that very moment. And it's an incredible account of a world that was rapidly changing in her lifetime. They're not personal accounts. She doesn't tell you much about her feelings, but she does tell you all of the people that she's meeting for supper at night, and the booksellers that she visits in country towns, and the people that she encounters on her trips to the health spas of Germany in the 1860s. So you do get a good insight into social life through these, as well as this amazing massive antiquarian detail.
Okay, very interesting. And of course, the set of people that she was mixing with and the class that she was in is far removed, of course, from the most of the people that I descend from, that lived out at Putnam and were, you know, on the working really long hours and wandering around with candles and so forth. But it's a different world, isn't it? And it was, their world
Yeah,
was different to hers, and both of those
yeah,
worlds completely alien to me. And you just get a snapshot of someone's life, and that's what I think we all love about genealogy, is it enables you um to look through the prism of someone else's lens, if you like, and to
yeah,
try and
very
understand
much
what
so.
they were
Yeah,
seeing. Yeah,
yeah.
and that's one of the things probably I love it. We haven't had any more questions, and I know you've got a train to catch, so I think we'll wrap up here. I hope you don't have to rush too far. I don't think you're too far from the station.
No, it's all right. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really, really great talk. I really appreciate it, and I know our members will love it. And I think it's one of
Thanks for
these
inviting
ones.
me.
Yeah,
I've really enjoyed it.
no, that's great. Thank you so much, and I will drop you an email in the next couple of days. So that's
Okay.
great. Julian, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Good night, everyone. We'll be back here for another webinar, I think on the 22nd of the month. I know that's 2 in February, but it's a DNA one, using GEBmatch to further your research, and that's with a chap called John Marshall, and it is at our usual time, 7:30 until 9 o'clock. So I'm going to close off for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, and the recording will be available certainly for members ongoing, but for non-members it will be available for a calendar month. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.